The tank, as a military invention, has been around for over 100 years. And throughout this time, there have been examples that were extremely well thought out and are basically the textbook definition of what a tank is and what it can be. And then there are examples of the opposite where the thing was such an abysmal failure, people scratch their heads years later wondering, what the hell were they thinking? However, the subject matter of this video is a tad unique because not only is it a complete, total disaster where it failed to meet every single requirement that it was adopted for, but it was so bad of a disaster that even the people in charge of the program in the military, as well as the corporation who designed and built these things, had an active attempt to conceal just how bad of a failure that this thing is. This vehicle also may classify as a case-in-point example of military and corporate corruption. And yet, somehow magically, it is one of my favorite military vehicles of all time. The Sgt. York. Hey everyone, this is John from EastCoastArmory.com, and I'm here today with a model showcase video for this 1/35th scale M247 Sgt. York DIVAD air defense vehicle. The model in this video is built for my own personal collection and is not for sale and or purchase. However, as I often mention in these build videos, I frequently take on commission build projects from models ranging between 1/35th scale and 1/6 scale. For availability and pricing information, that information would be best by contacting me through the email address listed below, which is info@EastCoastArmory.com. The model that we have here is built predominantly out of the box. However, I went ahead and deviated from the out-of-the-box configuration in both with terms of adding some external details, as well as also converting this model from the original condition of being static display to fully motorized. In this video, we're going to be going over all of these modifications, as well as giving this model a thorough in-box review. Because of that, this video is going to be a little bit longer compared to my standard model showcase videos. So stay tuned, sit back, relax, and enjoy because there's going to be a lot of content coming right at you. To start this video off, let's go ahead and take a quick walk around this model. And this vehicle here is one of my personal favorite failures, the M247 Sgt. York DIVAD. The Sgt. York was a self-propelled anti-aircraft vehicle developed by the US military during the late Cold War era. So we're looking at the 1970s into the 1980s. The vehicle was intended to replace the then aging M163 Vulcan with a vehicle that was going to be able to keep up with the main battle tanks and the new infantry fighting vehicles that were on the drawing board and were about to enter into production at that time. To put things in perspective, we're looking at the early adoption of the M1 Abrams as well as also the M2 and M3 Bradley. Also, not only was this vehicle intended to fulfill those roles, but it was also supposed to do it while on a budget. The vehicle's concept was to utilize as many off-the-shelf components as possible so that you can deliver a functional platform that's going to take less research and development, and also it's going to come in at a budget that is far more acceptable compared to just coming up with something from a blank slate or just, starting off with a blank canvas. And on paper, this seemed like a really smart and really well thought out idea. For the base platform that this vehicle was going to be built upon, it was deemed that the old surplus M48 patent hulls was going to be a perfect choice. Even though the M60 A1 and the M60 A3 were mostly the mainstay of the U.S. Armored Corps at the time, there were a plethora of older M48 patents still on inventory, and at this point, these vehicles were at the M48 A5 status, more or less. The M48 A5 was basically the last gasp of the M48 family in U.S. military service. Basically, the vehicle had the same power pack as the M60, as well as also with the M60's firepower and electronics package. So, on paper, this thing was going to be able to perform as well as the M60, with the vehicle having slightly less armor protection compared to the other M60 counterpart. So it was deemed that since the vehicle as a tank wasn't really going to be sufficient anymore, this would have been a perfect viable platform to retrofit into the self-propelled anti-aircraft vehicle. The only thing you have to do is just replace the turret, swap it out with a brand new one, throw in some new electronics, and voila, you now have a vehicle that mobility-wise is going to be able to keep up with the the tanks, but it's one that you're not exactly sacrificing a good vehicle like an M60 in order to do the same role. Another area where this vehicle was going to use some off-the-shelf equipment was with the electronics. For the radar system, no point reinventing the wheel. They just simply was going to repurpose the radar tracking system from the F-16. And last but not least, you need some kind of an armament package to knock out the airplanes. And this is where, again, the off-the-shelf components were going to be utilized. So there were three concepts that were thought up from the different manufacturers that threw their hat into the ring for the project. One of them, which is, in my opinion, still the coolest, was utilizing the armament from the A-10 Warthog, but mounted in a turret that was fitted onto the M48. However, as awesome as that is, as far as I know, outside of the one cool model that was made, they never actually entered into production or even a prototype with it. The other two that actually had prototypes that were made was one from Ford Aerospace, and the other was from General Dynamics. Both of them utilized two different armament systems. The Ford Aerospace system utilized twin 40mm Beaufort cannons that were already in U.S. inventory and have been since World War II, and the General Dynamics version was going to be utilizing the armament from the West German Gepard. Of course, by this time, the Bundeswehr was utilizing the Gepard to great effect, and the vehicle was a very successful vehicle in its own right. So it was really a no-brainer to take that proven package in not just in terms of the armament, but I also believe the General Dynamics version utilized the radar system from that vehicle as well, because again, no point reinventing the wheel, and just designed a new turret to mate it onto the M48 chassis. Both General Dynamics and Ford Aerospace built pilot models of each of these vehicles in order to put them up against one another in a series of tests to see which one was going to win the contract. And this is where the story gets very, very interesting. After the competition was completed, it is stated that the General Dynamics vehicle outperformed the Ford Aerospace one and was superior in basically every metric. However, the Ford Aerospace vehicle won the contract. And many people speculate that the reason why it won boils down purely to corruption. To the point where the vehicle not only did it not perform as well as the General Dynamics counterpart, but the vehicle was basically failing in every single known metric. And the people who were in charge of the program knew this, yet they still went with the Ford Aerospace version despite this. And immediately after the vehicle started entering into service was when the problems really started to be noticed and began to snowball. And basically, this vehicle failed at just about every of the metrics that was originally intended for this vehicle. So let's just start with the mobility. So as I stated before, the vehicle's original choice was the M48A5. The M48A5 utilizes the same power pack as the M60, so, it should be able to keep up with the tanks. And it did. Unfortunately, in order to fit the bigger turret and the equipment in order to power the electronics, the vehicle's weight increased. And with the vehicle's weight increase, it was now slower compared to a standard M48A5 and wasn't going to be able to keep up with the M60s, let alone the M1 Abrams, which the vehicle was intended to protect. The next was with the targeting system. As I stated before, this vehicle at heart utilizes the F-16 radar, which is a great idea. The F-16 is a fantastic fighter, and it's one that has an excellent radar. The problem is the F-16 radar is intended for use in the sky, where there's really nothing there to throw the radar off. When you take that same system and you mount it in a ground roll, it turned out that the radar was easily thrown awry from things such as power lines, wind vanes, and even, I believe, a fan from a porta potty. So this obviously is a bit of a problem if you can't lock on to its intended target. The final problem that the vehicle had was with the armament. Even though the 40mm Beaufort was an excellent system and was utilized by the US military to great effect for a multitude of decades, only I believe recently being retired on the AC-130, the ones used on the Sgt. York were problematic because of the condition that the units were in. These units were literally World War II surplus and were improperly maintained and stored by the US military. Many of the components were worn out and the units were just not in the best condition. Because of that, they were highly susceptible to jamming, and this is definitely a problem, specifically if you're trying to engage a high helicopter. The last thing you want to hear is a click instead of a bang. And unlike an M16 where you can just do an immediate action drill, you can't exactly tap and rack the 40mm Beaufort that's found on the Sgt. York. However, to be fair, this is more of a reflection how the US military maintains and stores their weapons as opposed to the designers at Ford Aerospace. Regardless, this vehicle inherited these problems. Everyone who worked on this project, in both the engineers from Ford Aerospace as well as also the military brass, knew actively about these problems and went out of their way to conceal and to mitigate them as much as possible. Their idea was fake it till you make it, and eventually at some point the bugs would be worked out and the vehicle would be solid. And for the most part, that actually kind of happened at the tail end. However, after a multitude of very public failed attempts and failed demonstrations, the US Congress had enough of it. The price tag on this thing was ballooning out of control, so they decided to pull the plug. The M247s, about 50 were produced. All of them were decommissioned. Most of them wound up as range targets. Several of them wound up in military museums, and they can be seen today. Before we go any further with the video, let's go ahead and take a step back to when this model was first started in order to get a good idea on what the base starter kit supplies you with. And here's the model at the start of the build. For the base starter kit, I'll be utilizing this 1980s vintage Tamiya M247 Sgt. York kit. And this kit here is a very guilty pleasure of mine. Although the Tamiya kit is very, very flawed in many respects, I just can't help to enjoy the hell out of building one of these models. The model that you see here was a stash inhabitant. I picked this kit up back in 2009 off of eBay, and it's been sitting in the stash literally ever since. As you can see from the box art over here, the layer of dust that's on the surface is pretty substantial. Having cleaned off the model's box art, as I touched upon before, the model was procured off of eBay back in 2009. At that time, I was going through a bit of a patent buying binge, and I was snatching up quite a few of the M60 and M48 kits that were on the market at that time. And to put things in perspective, you really had the kits from Tamiya and Academy. During this time frame, these kits were relatively easily come by and were also relatively affordable. The Sgt. York kit was about 25 to about 35 US dollars, around there is where I paid. And this was just something that was floating around. These kits weren't really that popular. In fact, the whole patent series didn't really have a resurgence until the 2010s timeframe, and we're basically still seeing that today. Well, these days, times have definitely changed because these kits have crossed over into the realm of collectability, and the prices on them have skyrocketed through the freaking roof. Before starting filming this video here, I went ahead and looked online to see what the prices and values are of these kits, and I was extremely shocked to find out that they start at around 60 US dollars, and I've even seen them go as far up as about 250 bucks. Which, by the way, I must say, for the quality of the kit itself, as much as I love the Tamiya Sgt. York model, it is definitely not worth $250. Specifically since about a month or so ago, TACCOM announced a brand new addition to the 1/35th scale marketplace, which is a 100% new tooling variant of the Sgt. York, which, spoiler alert, is going to be better than this kit here in every imaginable way. As for the Tamiya kit itself, this kit's tooling dates back to 1983. At this time, the real M247 Sgt. York was the new kit on the block. The vehicle was going through its research and development and was about to be adopted and fielded by the US military, which, as we all know, didn't really work out too well in the end. However, for Tamiya at that time to choose this vehicle of all the other vehicles out there to produce a kit of was actually one that made some sound business sense. At the time, the M247 was in the news. It was the new cutting edge thing that the US military was working on, so there's going to be a bit of demand out there for this vehicle to be released as a kit. Another reason why this kit made sound, solid business sense was because Tamiya already had a bulk of the components on hand to build this kit, courtesy from the 1/35th scale M48A3 patent kit that Tamiya released back in 1981. That kit is an excellent kit in its own right. It's also one of those kits that just, has stood the test of time, but that's best for another topic for another day. Regardless, because they went ahead and tooled up that kit, they had the majority of the hull components in order to produce the Sgt. York. So they basically, in essence, did what the US military did by taking a M48 and just upgrading it to the M247 Sgt. York specs. However, Tamiya, by doing this, did take several shortcuts, and this is something that does affect the accuracy of the build, and you'll see this once I go ahead and crack the box open. So these kits were released by Tamiya, and a large number of them were produced. They were widely distributed, as Tamiya has always had some excellent distribution, and for the next 15 or 20 some odd years, the old ones that were in production during the late 1980s time frame were still readily available. At this time, the kits were distributed in the United States by MRC. As I've touched upon before, MRC was the sole distributor of Tamiya up until the 1990s time frame when Tamiya USA was founded. Oddly enough, MRC is still in business today and are the distributor for the Academy 1/35 scale tank kits that are on the market, and Academy themselves also made an M247 Sgt. York, but that's a topic for another video, which will also be posted shortly after this video here drops. Outside of the kit's original release from the 1980s time frame, Tamiya themselves would eventually re-release the M247 Sgt. York kit in 2006. So there are still a decent number of them floating around on the market. However, like I touched upon before, in recent months, it seems like that this thing has crossed over into the realm of collectability, and because of that, you're going to be paying collector prices. Also, just bouncing back to what I mentioned before about the TACOM release of this model, with that new kit now entering into production, I seriously doubt very much if Tamiya will ever re-release this kit here. So the chances of finding one in a new production format is probably going to be very slim, but Tamiya has went ahead and surprised us in the past with some nostalgic re-releases. Having said that, even though the TACOM kit is going to be better than this older kit here, this kit still has some viable options and features on it that, in my opinion, are still worth to take a look at today for a certain group of individuals. Of course, I'll be going over this in the tail end of this video when I discuss skill level and recommendations. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and take a look at the graphic design. Starting with the box art, it's your typical Tamiya white background setting with the vehicle in the foreground. The vehicle is excellently rendered, which is again no surprise for Tamiya, and of course the drawing, or I should say the illustration here, is actually superior to the tooling on the kit, which you'll see once I crack it open. The vehicle is painted in its iconic red desert merc camouflage scheme, which several real photographs of the real Sgt. York were depicted in this format. We have the mustached commander guy right there in the commander's hatch area. And even the radar sections are appropriately painted. The detailing on the M48A5 hull looks really, really good. And I also like the way the cast texturing was rendered on the illustration on the bow section. Overall, it's, your typical awesome Tamiya box art. The remainder of the graphic design is what is typical for modern AFV of this era. You would see similar typefaces used on the M1 Abrams, and the Challenger, I believe, used this type of format as well. But M247 Sgt. York right there. By the way, this is not a fancy type of ink on the surface where it's reflective. It's just that this portion of the box here is faded, and this here is actually the original color used. Of course, the kit here was distributed by MRC, which you can see right there from that logo. And because of that, like with the other MRC kits, the box is considerably larger compared to the standard Tamiya USA imported models. The other info is right here on the top. Gives you just a brief description of the features. And of course, right there on the upper right-hand side, we have the Tamiya logo. The artwork is enlarged just for framing because, again, the model looks awesome on the box art, but, sadly, the kit is much smaller in 135. And paint and cement are not included, which is quite customary. On the side tabs here, we have some color illustrations. Again, it's a Tamiya, so it's typical with this type of layout. We have a really cool color diagram here of the Sgt. York with its red desert camo. we have a interesting little blurb here about the brief history of the vehicle, which is pretty cool because the system was still in development at this time, and I guess they figured it was going to be adopted. We have a real photograph of the M48, I'm sorry, the Sgt. York right here. Of course, we have the MRC corporate info. And this is also interesting to point out, but these kits were molded in Japan. After this period over here, Tamiya would move the manufacturing from Japan to the Philippines. And this is what we see on Tamiya kits from the last 20 or 25 some odd years. On the side tab, we have just your typical verbiage with a nice little thumbnail of the model. This is kit number 3626A. Obviously, the exact same image on the opposite side. And on this section over here, we have some more images. This is the Summer Verdant version of the Mercama, which again looks very sexy. A little diagram here of the Commander, and also another really cool photograph of the actual vehicle in testing, and it's most notably its color, where we can see it with the really cool and sexy dark olive drab, which was typical on many US military vehicles of this era. Well, cracking open the box, we'll reveal the contents. Obviously, this being an older Tamiya kit, there aren't going to be any modern amenities in here, such as photo etch or resin or turned metal or none of that stuff. This is as old school as you can possibly get. The first thing I want to point out is the plastic that the model is molded in. All of the Tamiya Sgt. York kits were molded in this beige, brownish type plastic. This is the same type of plastic that you would see on a number of other modern military vehicles that were released by Tamiya. Such notable examples would be the M1 Abrams as well as the M2 or M3 Bradleys. As I mentioned before, a large portion of this kit is going to be recycled from the Tamiya M48A3, and if you ever built one of those models, you're going to be greeted with many familiar components. Starting, of course, with the lower hull. Starting with the lower hull, you'll notice that quite clearly it is a single piece molding, as it is borrowed from the M48A3. Absolutely no changes were made to this molding, and it's the exact same tooling found on the two kits. One thing that I always found notable about the Tamiya M48 kit is how everything is molded as one piece, while on the earlier M60A1 kits that came out beforehand, the top sections here were two separate components that need to be glued to the bathtub in order to get the complete shape. On the M48, it's one less thing you have to worry about. Also, at some point in time on the M48 kit, Tamiya had the idea to make the models motorized, although, as far as I know, Tamiya never went ahead and produced their M48 kit in a motorized format. They were always exclusively sold as static, but the artifacts are still left on the molding for the motorization option. Here you get to see the locations for the batteries, as well as the gearbox rails, and those two large holes that are found on the bottom of the hull in order for the sections of the gearbox to be bolted to one another. This is something that's been a scourge on this kit amongst many modeling elitists out there, and the number one thing that they like to poo-poo is because they have these large gaping holes here and they always have to do the bodywork to plug them up. One other thing interestingly to point out about the Tamiya M48 model is the section over here for the rear return, or I should say the tension idler. This was something that always confused me as a kid, specifically when I first built this model, because you put in all the swing arms, and then there's this one little hole over here, and it's just there, and it looks like something's supposed to be plugged in where something is missing. And that is true on the M48. Originally, there would have been a trailing idler found in this section over here, which was, of course, a leftover appendix part from the M47, but at some point, this piece was eliminated towards the A2 or A3 upgrade on the patent. When this happened, this little section here was plated over with a small little cover plate. This cover plate detailing is absent on the Tamiya tooling. However, this is something that I actually designed a 3D printed component for, and I will be mentioning that as the video progresses. But again, it's one of those things as a kit that blew my mind, seeing that it's in the open position. And then I always wondered, I wonder if Tamiya ever had the idea to release any other options of the M48. Perhaps at some point in time they were going to make one with an A1 upper hull and you have the provision right there for the idlers, but sadly that never happened. And we just have two options for M48s from Tamiya, the M48A3 and the Sgt. York. As for the moldings themselves, they're quite typical for Tamiya, which means they are excellent. The moldings are nice and clean. There's not really a whole lot of flash to mention. There are some mold lines right here where the molds all intersected in order to mold this piece, but this is something that's easily polished away. And it's not really anything that should be noteworthy for that matter. Just want to cover all bases. This section here is of course made in Japan, which you can see right there from the molding, and obviously this would change on the newer re-release or other production versions of the M48 and later the reissue of the Sgt. York. One last thing to mention are the fasteners that are integrally molded into the suspension mounts. You'll see that the fastener details are there. They would be considered a bit simplistic compared to other contemporary new tooling kits on the market, but for the last 35 plus years, these pieces here were perfectly sufficed and did the job just fine. And in all fairness, they still do in my opinion. It's not until you compare them with something like a Dragon or possibly the new Tacom kits is when you start seeing these older kits here beginning to show their age. But again, having said that, these pieces here are perfectly fine. The next thing I want to mention that are carried over from the Legacy patent kit are the suspension parts. And here you get to see all the row wheels, the final drives, the swing arms, the sprockets, basically all the remaining components to flesh out the suspension of this vehicle. All these parts here are again nothing more than the M48 parts, just molded with the brown plastic. And in case anyone has ever not built Tamiya M48, first you're missing out on an awesome kit, but secondly, here you get to see what the parts look like up close. Note here's the exhaust deflector grill, which is part of the problem that this kit has. Not so much for assembly, but one for detail accuracy that I'll touch upon in a moment. There you can see the lift rings found on the bottom of the hull. And on this side here you can see the swing arms, which are also integrally molded to their spring stops. These two over here are for the two front wheel and idler assemblies. And you can also see the final drives, which are configured for motorization, and then we have those plugs that are right over here that convert it to static. Taking the parts out of the bag for the very first time fills the room up with the aroma of vintage plastic model kit, which is something that I personally love. It's a real interesting aroma, and it's one that you generally appreciate, specifically if you build a lot of old model kits. Anyway, with that out of the way, you get to see the components now without any glare from the plastic bag. Starting with the row wheels, once that camera focuses in, you can see the pattern on the tires, which is appropriate for an M48. Also, you get to see the detailing found on the sprocket, also something that held up very well with age. The one bit of detailing that's absent on these sprockets, and it's also something that's commonly overlooked on just about the majority of other vintage and contemporary kits of both patents and M60s, is the absence of the mud slits. This is something that is generally overlooked, more likely due to production issues, but it's also something that I generally add on my builds. Also, as I also mentioned, it's not necessarily inaccurate because there were some suppliers that casted these components for the government that did not have the mud slits present. So this is something that is not necessarily an inaccuracy. On a similar note, you get to see the quality of the return rollers and the swing arms themselves. They do have the torsion bar detailing present, and everything looks really, really good. And as I touched upon before, these kits really did age quite well with age. With the carryover parts from the patent out of the way, it's now time to focus on what makes this kit specifically a Sgt. York, and this would include the following sprues and components. This runner right here is the bulk of the Sgt. York model, and it consists of the top hull fittings as well as also many of the fittings for the turret. So we see a ton of parts. We have here the front hatch. Again, some of the parts, by the way, are just straight up M48, such as the hatch, the side bins, which are right here, and the air filtration boxes. The other components are purely Sgt. York, such as the little panel here for the side of the turret, the F-16 conical radar, the spinny spin radar, which is what I call it, even though I know that's definitely not the appropriate term, but there it is right there. And again, the details on these are pretty good. If the camera focuses in, you can see some of the little square details that are present on these pieces over here, which are present on the real Sgt. York radar systems, and it's a nice feature that Tamiya molded them into the model here. We have the 1980s era smoke grenade launchers. These components are seen on several other Tamiya modern, or I should say at the time modern era kits, like the M1s and so on and so forth. We got tow cables. And what's cool about this kit is that the tow cables are made out of plastic. They aren't a multimedia type assembly like they are seen on other Tamiya kits like the M60A3 or the LVT, where we have plastic end connectors and then the cable sections are string and you have to basically glue that together. On the Sgt. York here, it's just one simple piece. You paint it, snip it, and install it to the model. Here you can see the barrel assemblies for the 40mm Boffer, or Bofers, plural, there's two of them of course. And we have here the brush guards for an M48A5. So with this runner out of the way, this leads us to the last runner, which would have been a single molding but snapped over time, and that contains the last of the plastic parts. And this is where the kit falls off the rails. So this component here is one mold and consists of some new tooling. That new tooling, most notably, would be the turret. However, where the kit falls short is with the upper hull. You see, this upper hull here is nothing more than the Tamiya M48A3 hull, just rinsed, washed, and repeated. If anyone knows a thing or two about the Sgt. York, if you look at the rear section, it is completely reworked and is completely different compared to the rear area on the standard M48A5, or in this case, the M48A3. Not just to rest on that section, the entire upper hull is not an M48A5, it's an M48A3, and it's missing all the provisions that would be present on the M48A5 upper section. The tooling here really does show that Tamiya phoned this portion of the model in from orbit. The only revision that Tamiya did to this section here to make it suitable for the Sgt. York was to add these 2 points right here on the inner section, which are intended for you, the builder, to drill out with a pin vise. The idea of drilling these 2 holes out is to secure onto the rear this angled ramp section, which according to Tamiya will transform the rear section from a standard M48A3 to the Sgt. York. Which couldn't be any further from the truth. This thing looks absolutely nothing like the Sgt. York, and it's the biggest folly of the kit. The entire rear section is completely wrong on the Tamiya kit. The Tamiya kit wants you to recycle, again, the exhaust deflector grill. Again, wrong for the Sgt. York. I'll go ahead and throw a picture up of the Sgt. York from the tail end, so you get to see exactly how terribly misshapen the Tamiya one truly is. Why did Tamiya do this? Your guess is as good as mine. My guess, or a most logical guess, would be to save money on tooling, of course. Injection molded tools are very, very, very expensive, and Tamiya decided, oh, maybe we could, cut some corners and save the cost of designing an entire new upper hull mold. But that doesn't really hold much water, because if that was the case, this could have just been the piece from the M48A3, but it's not. This mold here is entirely new mold because it was meant to mold this entire section as one complete unit. So they still have to spend the cost of making the mold, but they didn't go ahead and go the next step by just redesigning the upper hull section for use on an M48A5. Or in this case, screw the M48A5, just one for the Sgt. York specifically. Since you're using the Sgt. York turret, tool up the Sgt. York upper hull. They spent the money to make the mold, and yet they fell short on that one aspect. It's one of those mysteries that will boggle me for the end of time, and unless someone actually worked at Tamiya and can, chime in here on exactly what the hell were they thinking, it will forever be left up to speculation. On the positive side, the hull actually is a very nice molding, and the details are nice and crisply molded, as wrong as they are, but take that for what you will. So with the hull out of the way, this leads us to the turret. The turret is actually really, really nice. It has all of the appropriate geometry. It has all of the appropriate appendages, which would be found on the real Sgt. York. I'm not sure how Tamiya even cobbled this together, if they had access to the real vehicle, which is doubtful, or if they just were able to look at all the various photographs of this vehicle that were out in the press and were able to cobble it together from there. Regardless, they actually did a pretty decent job, considering. The turret, I'm really happy with the geometry. To me, it looks like it's pretty good, but to be fair, I've never seen a real Sgt. York in the flesh, but from the various images I've seen over time, the Tamiya one looks like it's okay. Some of the features that are found on the Tamiya kit would be the lift handles, which are molded as little blades, which again is quite customarily found on Tamiya models, and this one here is no different. The inner portion over here needs some assembly because of the Bofors pivoting system, but more information on this, of course, is to follow. However, knowing this kit as much as I do from my first go-ahead at one, they do build extremely easy and pretty much effortlessly. And that's really it for the polystyrene bits, and this takes us to the flexible components found on this model. First here, we have a spread of polycaps. These are obviously going to be used for the suspension as well as the upper hull retention. These are quite typically seen on a large number of Tamiya models, and for a long time were a hallmark found on their kits, and it's typical to be a quality. The next thing that also differentiates this model from their standard M48 are the tracks. The Sgt. York, of course, based on M48A5, and by that point, the standard chevron tracks were replaced with the double octagonal pattern of tracks, which would be seen on M60A1 and M60A3s. These tracks here were a new bit of tooling designed by Tamiya at the time and were specifically intended for use on the Sgt. York. If I get the tab here in focus, you'll see it says MM York right there on the molding. What's interesting to point out is that Tamiya would then repurpose these exact same tracks on their M60 kit that was retooled in the 1980s time frame. That kit is the M60A3 and was also recycled again on their M60A1 kit, which is still in production. I'm not sure if the tracks still say York on them or if they change the verbiage on that tab. However, these tracks here are the exact same size as the ones found on their M60 counterpart kits. As for the tracks themselves, they are your typical Tamiya quality with the face detailing on them, which are pretty good, specifically for the material and the age of tooling that these tracks are molded in. You see the interior sections do have their interior detailing present. However, oddly enough, the track guide horn is still in the center portion of the link as opposed to being straddling the two sections where they hinge together. A bit of a carryover from the original M60 release. But regardless, these tracks are actually really good quality. The track material is the same material that Tamiya used on a large number of their tracks up until the 1990s time frame when they would switch over to that other material that would be seen on their newer tooling kits of the time, like you would see on their Tiger 1 and also on their Panthers. And which, by the way, are still 1000% better compared to the new tooling kits they have, which use individual link and link tracks, which, by the way, Tamiya, shame on you. Those tracks are garbage and you know it. So, back to these ones over here. The quality on them are pretty good. They tend to age very well. My older Sgt. York kit that I built when I was a kid, the tracks are in perfect condition on those. So it's a testament to how good this material was that Tamiya was using during this era. Obviously, these tracks are definitely going to be used on this model without any problems. The one thing that I do want to mention is that originally these tracks would have been held together with this amber colored rubber band, and that did not age very well and just disintegrated over time, which you can see a stain of it right here in the box. That's the rubber band. It just dry rotted and melted its way into the fiber, permanently embedding itself into the cardboard. So that's something to point out. On the decals, well, here they are right here. We have a very small abridged decal sheet with just a few markings on them. And that's really all the markings you need. They are obviously water slide decals, and in the past I've had some really good results with old school Tamiya decals, so we'll see if that pans out for this build as well. The next thing I want to mention is just some of the other literature found in here. First, we have here a cool one. This is an MRC Tamiya catalog that was supplied in all of their models back in the day, and nothing screams Tamiya nostalgia more to me than one of these pamphlets. We got here that really cool RC Porsche 959. We even have another Porsche 959, but this is a static one and it has a cutaway showing the interior. We got here the M2 Bradley, this is the M3 Bradley, which is also a really cool kit. I want to add one to my collection. if I don't already have one, you know, hint, hint. We got their 1/350 scale ships, and on the inside here, if anyone has ever grown up in the 90s or in the 80s and Googled hours over Tamiya catalogs, oh yeah, we got some cool stuff here. What's actually pretty interesting is I built most of the tanks that are in this little pamphlet here, but it's always cool to see them. Oh, and for you RC 116 guys, here we have the original Tamiya RC King Tiger with the clutch system, which, by the way, on the EC channel, I actually have a video of one of these models that I did a model showcase on a number of years ago, and you can actually see it running around. Fortunately, it was being driven by my father, who had a hard time with the throttle control, but you can still see one of these in operation regardless. Old school original M1 Abrams. That's a really awesome kit. And we also have some other cars and other things found in here. Again, I just love these old school Tamiya pamphlets. And this leads us to the instruction manual. Quite clearly Tamiya. Some sections are obviously rinsed, washed, and repeated from their M48 kit, which, needless to say, is not a problem because their M48 kit had some excellent instructions and they went together very well. But obviously for this one here, you can see the different changes that are needed in order to build it as a Sgt. York. Now, of course, on the back pattern, we have a nice little painting scheme, and it has a nice layout on exactly how to apply the blotches on the vehicle in order to go with the Merc camouflage job. And one last thing to mention, as a why not, is a nice little envelope here for MRC to mail it in to see if you can get your Tamiya catalog. I wonder what would happen if someone actually mails this out. And here's the hull going through its assembly. At this point, you can see that before I even install any of the suspension components, the cast texturing is first applied. The cast texturing is something that I generally like to do on these patent-based family of vehicles because this would be true to form for the real vehicle. The most signature and iconic bit of detailing found in this pattern of vehicle is the fact that the hull is one encompassing bathtub casting. And if you ever had the opportunity to see an M48 or an M60 in person, pay close attention to the lower hull. It is a bit on the rougher casted side. The cast texturing itself was applied in my usual format with use of red putty. In the comments, or I should say in the video description, you should see a link to where I go over this technique over here in more depth, and you get a good idea on how the application is done. The putty work, once added, will give you the nice look of the cast texturing, and it's a nice way to really enhance the look of the stock Tamiya or Academy base vehicle, depending on obviously which one you're working on. The next thing to mention is the axis cap that we have right over here. On the Tamiya pattern of M48 kits, it has this interesting quirk where we have the mount here for the trailing idler. And this is something that I personally believe Tamiya built into their model because they perhaps potentially had the idea to release different variants of the M48 patent. And because of that, you have this feature where we have the, what would be on the real vehicle, the mount for the trailing idler. And on the Tamiya kit here, it's just a hollow tube drilled all the way through, and there's no detailing or any other type of equipment that gets adhered to the other end. It's just an open tube, like the way you see here for the torsion arm, swing arms. For the longest period of time, you're basically just left with that piece in the open position. However, about a year ago or so, I went ahead and developed a 3D printed insert that plugs up this area here, giving you the appropriate detailing which would be found on the real vehicle. The piece is made out of HD 3D print and can be found on the ECA Shapeways store link listed below. I've touched upon this little bit of equipment on a few other videos at this point, and as I mentioned before, the ECA set gives you a number of these fittings, so that with one set you could actually use to upgrade about 5 other patent-based vehicle kits. So I'm still burning through the stash that I have, and I believe I have like maybe 2 more to go, so we'll see how that rolls out in other videos. But once the unit is installed, it really does improve the look of the model tenfold. And this is something that's best installed before the addition of the swing arms. Once the swing arms go in place, you can still fit it in place, but it requires a little bit more manhandling, as opposed to right now where the piece just snips off of the sprue and just drops directly where it needs to go. The piece has the correct geometry to it, as well as also the fastener locations that are all integrally printed on. It's done in HD 3D prints, and again, can be found at the link listed in the video description. The next thing I want to mention involves the motorization conversion. This is, again, probably one of the more interesting aspects of the model, and it's probably one of the areas where the Tamiya kit still is as relevant today as it was when it was first released back all those years ago. So, in the past, well, first I'm using the Tamiya twin gearbox that we have right over here. I've already touched upon this already in this video, as well as other videos that are found on the channel. And this is something that has been seen on a few other builds, like I just referenced. However, what's different about this one is how I'm going to be mounting it to the model. In the past, I basically just secure it in place. I make some kind of a column type unit, and then the unit fastens to the bottom via a fastener, and that holds it in place, and it's basically good to go. However, in recent builds, I've been revising how I install the gearbox on these motorized converted models, where I'm trying to opt for something that is as low profile and as low key as possible. And I went ahead and came up with this idea that we have here, and I basically developed this on the M247 Starship Academy build that should post before this video does here, but basically it's the same exact concept. What I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be recycling the gearbox rails that are integrally molded into the hull. Obviously, these rails were originally designed for a gearbox to be fitted in place, and, well, the provisions are there, might as well put them to good use. In order to mount the gearbox in place, I took a section here of 1/8 inch thick polystyrene, cut it to shape, add a bevel to this section over here so it could go as flush against the rear section here of the hull as possible. When the time comes, this is going to be glued permanently to the model in this type of a manner, and then the gearbox will simply now mount directly on top of that. As you can see, it makes a nice perfect platform for the gearbox to be fitted in place. The height is also where it needs to be, where it's basically in the rule of thumb is on these motorized converted models, I like to have the gearbox shaft in the same exact location as it is for the static conversion. So once the unit just fits in place, it should give you exactly the proper tension that is required. The other thing to mention about installing a gearbox like this, and this is, I cannot stress this enough, is this thing has to be as square as humanly possible once installed. The unit is going to be adhered on via adhesive, so no fasteners are going to be utilized. So when you install it, you want to make sure, double check, triple check, quadruple check that everything is squared away. If the unit is installed in a off-centered manner, this is obviously going to cause some issues when it comes time for running the model. On the gearbox over here, one thing that's cool about the M60, or I should say it's true for the 60, but it's also true here for the M48, is you have a lot of visual cues to help line you up. Right here on the center portion here of the rear grillwork, you have this channel that's integrally molded in. And also on the spine over here of the gearbox, we have this center section that's also integrally molded on. Well, this gives a fantastic visual cue to help line up and make sure everything is as square as humanly possible. Once I'm actually committing to the installation, I'm going to go ahead and measure everything out, fasten everything in place with the glues, and once it's, set in place, I'm going to walk away without anything disturbing this section over here, allowing the adhesives to set. Once the adhesives are fully set, then the gearbox installation is complete, and the model at that point is ready to slide off into the next leg of the motorization conversion, which is the electronics, but I'll circle upon that later on. What I mentioned about the gearbox is that I went ahead and glued some sections of styrene to the bottom portion here to act as a spacer, because if you just have the gearbox mounted directly onto the plastic panel over here, it's slightly too low and it's going to dig into the bottom portion here of the final drives. So by adding just some sections of sheet styrene, this acts as a standoff, bumps up the gearbox to the appropriate height, and once fitted in place, it's going to align perfectly as it would have originally have been intended for. So as the build progresses, this leads us to the point that we have here. Currently, the upper hull is about to get outrigged with all of its details, and then the model is going to progress further to the finish line. However, it is at this point here where I'm going to be adding another HD 3D printed upgrade in order to help improve the stock Tamiya kit, or at least polish it up to a higher degree compared to the kit offering. as I touched upon before, one of the biggest weaknesses and bafflingly surprising mistakes that were made by Tamiya when they came up with this kit was they just straight up rinsed, washed, and repeated the tooling from their M48A3. And some of the mistakes that carried over, specifically in regards to a Sgt. York, is with the tin work. Both the tin work found on the front and rear sections here, as I touched upon before, are just the standard ones from the Tamiya M48. Basically, you would have a small little indentation found right over there. Then you would have this fender support, because this is how it would be found on several M48A3s that were in service. However, when the vehicles were upgraded to Sgt. York, basically all of them had the crossed embossed stampings that are generally found on some later versions of the A3, but more likely these are generally found on the M48A5. And it's even found on the Boxer, like I touched upon before. Well, like I stated before, this is probably one of the biggest dings on the kit besides, you know, this bad boy over here. But regardless, I figured when I was working on this batch of Sgt. Yorks, I'm like, you know what? Let me go ahead and finally address at least one of the kit's shortcomings, and that includes the detailing here found on the tin work. And the solution that I came up with involves this little fret that we have right here. You see, in order to give the missing detailing, I went ahead and developed a set of HD 3D printed detail components, which will drop directly onto the Tamiya stock fenders, giving you the appropriate detailing. Here you can see the components right here. You'll notice that there are 4 missing. This is because at the time I'm working on this model over here, I've already completed the Academy version of the Sgt. York model, which, depending on when these videos get edited, may or may not be posted either before or after this video over here. So, well, you know, time will tell on that. But here you can see what the remaining of the 3D printed parts look like. These are, again, HD 3D printed, and these are listed on the ECA Shapeway store. With one set, you are able to equip not 1, but 3 of these Sgt. York models. But not only will they work on this particular kit, but there are also, like I stated before, lots of M48A3s that had the embossed X crimps found on the tin work. And these parts here will easily be able to be dropped onto the Tamiya version or the Academy version of the kits if one chooses to upgrade it past what the kit gives you. As I mentioned before, the parts are HD 3D printed and contain all of the fine printed on details which would be present on the components. This would include the X embossed crimp lines. We also have here the angled support for the end portion of the tin work, and we even have the little fasteners that are integrally printed on. Note that these components are for both front and rear sections of the tin work, so both the front and rear areas are going to have the appropriate detailing which would be found on the actual vehicles. In order to get the components in place, you are going to have to do some slight modifications to the kit itself. Here you can see what the stock tin work looks like. Note that there is this small little strip that's integrally molded into the front and rear portions here and here. And in order to get the new 3D printed parts to fit on, both of these strips need to be amputated. On the front section on this side, you can see what it looks like with the component polished down. And in order to do this, this was very quickly and easily done with a flat needle file that I have here. And I basically just went up and down the surface in this type of a manner for a number of passes until basically the necessary amount of material was removed. Once the component is nice and flush, you are then ready to install the new HD 3D printed component. Also, one quick thing to point out about this build, and this is true for all of the patent family builds, specifically the ones from Tamiya and Academy, are with the air filtration boxes. The air filtration boxes are supplied with the model and are decently rendered overall. However, the one improvement that I always make on these builds is with the air intakes that are found right over here on the end portion of the filter box. These on the real units are actually tubes, as obviously they need to suck air in to filter them before they go into the engine manifold. However, on the kits, they tend to be molded solid, or specifically on the older tooling kits like the Tamiya M48 and also the M60 and M68-1 specifically. If you're working on a model that have the pieces closed off, this is a very simple and easy addition to remedy. Basically, with a small Dremel bit and with a pin vise, you just drill the 2 sections out. You don't have to drill in too deep or that large specifically, but like the way you see it here is more than enough to complete the task at hand. So here's the model with the electronics all completed. We have the gearbox, the battery, and also the main switch. This model is going to have the switch wired into the turret, so I need to have an extra long wire as well as quick connect jacks in order to separate the turret from the hull if need be. With the way the model is wired, it can actually go in two directions. So we have center is off, one way will propel the model forward, and the opposite way will propel the model in reverse. In order to do the wiring on this switch over here, I have a link to a diagram that shows exactly how I configured this type of switch, and it can be found in the video description below. This is the same diagram that I've touched upon in several other videos where I perform a similar procedure like the one found on this model. However, now that everything is wired up, I could do a quick little bench test. So we have a set of batteries right here. It's going to be powered by two AA's like I touched upon before. And if I hit the switch one way, it goes in reverse. And if I hit the switch the other way, it now goes forward. Simple and sweet. From this point onward, it's now time for me to secure the hatch inside of the turret. Normally on these type of builds, I like to secure the switch underneath one of the crew hatches because this is obviously a very logical location to secure this type of bit of equipment. However, on other builds, this is relatively easily done because the hatches are either designed to be functional from the get-go or are easily modified where I drill out the hinges and use little pins, and I could go ahead and have the hatch now in a functional manner. For the Sgt. York kit, however, that's not going to be the case. It's going to be a little bit more tricky because, as you can see, the hatches do not have any of the hinge points that are functional, and the ones that are integrally molded on are so tiny that trying to drill them out is just not going to be feasible. So I'm going to have to come up with some kind of a magnetic or quick-type disconnect system in order to secure the hatches in place so it looks seamless, but also have in a way that can be easily removed in order to get access to the switch. One other thing I want to mention at this time involves with the switch itself. One thing that I noticed about several of my older motorized converted builds is that after a while, the contacts inside the switch here begin to corrode. And this is something that I've noticed when the models are just sitting in the clear plastic display case, for a long period of time. I go to take it out, to run it now and then, and I hit the switch and nothing happens. What happens is on the inside portion of the switch, the contacts corrode, and this is something that can be a bit of a problem, but fortunately it's not something that's detrimental. After moving the switch a number of times, eventually the contacts scratch up and the functionality is restored, or you could just go in there with a drop of alcohol and do the same type of trick. In order to prevent this from happening, though, on my recent builds, I've been incorporating a new type of feature, and this is something I've also been retrofitting many of my older builds with, and that is with this tube that we have here of Dielectric grease. This is something that's very affordable and can be found very easily. I picked this up off of Amazon, and the link is found in the video description listed below. And basically, this grease here is squirted inside of the contacts, and it protects the contacts from any sort of corrosion. And with this, you just add a little drop, you work it into the switch itself, and at that point there, it's good to go, and your switch will be much more resilient to forms of just idle corrosion. Like I said before, this is something that I've been incorporating on all of my current motorized builds, and I've been retrofitting all of my older builds with the same stuff, and it looks like so far it does the job pretty well. So jumping ahead a little bit, here we have the turret with the switch situation now ironed out. On the inside here, you can see how the switch is secured. It's strapped to the roof of the turret casing right over here, and there's your access to the switch right there through the rear hatch. After looking at the top hatch and the rear hatch, it was deemed that was easier and more beneficial to do it on this hatch over here as opposed to the one right here on the top. So the top one was just glued on as it would be normally on the kit, and the back one here is the point of entry. The switch is supported by two columns that are made out of turned scrap resin that I machined on the lathe to the appropriate lengths, fastened in place via screws, and then everything was glued permanently to the turret roof. Here you can see the wiring. It's all been shrink tubed in place. Make sure it doesn't fray or it doesn't get in the way. And it's definitely long enough to protrude from the bottom of the hull where it could then easily make the connections on the hull itself. On the actual switch, you can see the Dielectric grease has been applied. I added to the contacts themselves on the inner portion. I worked it in like I mentioned before, and I also went ahead and added some on the external contacts. For the hatch, this is where I had to think a little bit outside of the box on this one. So the hatch needs to be removable. Obviously, I can't make the unit hinge because the hinges are far too small, and trying to fabricate that is just not going to work. So instead, I made the hatch removable via magnets, which you can see right here. With the way the kit hatch is designed, there is this well found on the inner portion here of the frame, which was a perfect location to fabricate this little box system that we have here. The box is designed to fit in the inner confines of that recess, and I just simply went ahead and fabricated out of some strips and lengths of sheet styrene. The styrene contains 4 magnets, as you can see right there, and they are housed inside of the unit, making for a nice little self-contained little package. In order to snap onto the model, we have 2 other bulkheads made from the same type of styrene, and you can see the magnets that have been secured to them. These units have been permanently glued to the rear portion of the turret, and then to clip it in, all you gotta do is just line the hatch up, and as you can see, the magnets just gobble it up to where it needs to go. As you can see, once it's in place, it is completely indistinguishable from any of the other components, which is exactly what you're looking for, specifically for a detailed model like this. And when I want to get access to the hatch, or to the switch, I should say, it just pops right off without any sort of issues. Here's my switch. I can turn the model on, either forward or reverse or whatever have you. And then once the model's in operation, off it goes, and the model can operate in a indistinguishable look as, again, its static counterpart. While the turret is going through its assembly, right now it's setting aside with the glues drying, I might as well turn my attention to the hull and do a test run. At the moment, I have the set of tracks and as well some wheels from the other Sgt. York build that's going through an OTR treatment, so I'm going to go ahead and temporarily borrow some of these parts here just to do a basic function test. The batteries are hooked up into their holder, and with the way I designed the sets is that the jacks are opposite, so that even without the turret in place, I can still test drive the unit by simply just plugging it together. So you'll see it in operation right now. Hopefully it works out the way I intended. And I think it's running really good. So what I did before, by the way, I put the tracks on, I went ahead and thoroughly lubed up the gearbox with the grease that's applied with the Tamiya gearbox, as well as some drops of oil on some key locations. That should be more than enough to keep the thing lubricated for a good period of time. I also went ahead and fabricated a brand new front axle. With the way the kit is originally designed, there are 2 little plastic pegs that get installed into these sections over here, and this supports the road wheels. Obviously, for motorization, that's something that's less than ideal, so I always replace them with a metal bar. This is something that's also advantageous because just like with the original M60 kit that Tamiya designed back in 1970, the model was originally intended to be motorized, like I touched upon earlier, and it was supposed to be configured in a way where you see here where we have a steel axle that connects the 2 road wheels together. The axle itself is nothing more than an 1/8 of an inch steel rod. This is per spec from the original Tamiya one, so it's just a direct drop-in replacement. Fortunately, 1/8 of an inch stock can be found basically in any hardware store, which is exactly where I picked up this one, and it just slides directly in place as, you know, Mr. Tamiya intended. And once everything is thoroughly, aligned properly, you can see again that the model just wants to run and run and run and run. You can also see why these gearboxes are so popular with small-scale radio-controlled builds. Because with this gearbox here, if you have it hooked up to a micro RC system, you can actually have the thing run with a radio-controlled format because of the dual motor gearbox. Obviously, that's way more than what I intend to use these models for. So for me, simple motorization is fine. But as you can see, if someone's clever enough, and I have seen them out there on YouTube, you can configure this with a radio-controlled system. One other quick thing I want to mention at this time is that you'll see that the sprockets perform absolutely flawlessly. Those ECA drop-in inserts do the charm, and they are definitely highly recommended for anyone who's encompassing this gearbox here and are using it to motorize convert either a Tamiya or an Academy pattern of model with the hex systems and also with the original polycap systems that these older kits do have as part of their design. Starting with the running gear on this model is all 100% stock and assembles out of the box with ridiculous amounts of ease. This is a hallmark found on these older pattern Tamiya kits, and this one here is absolutely no exception. The wheels are held on with the polycap system, which was always a hallmark found on these Tamiya kits, and it makes for easy assembly and even easier installation. Hopping to the rear of the suspension brings us to the sprockets. These again are the stock sprockets. The only addition I made were the mud slits that are found on the inner drum. This was done with the same techniques that I've touched upon in a couple of videos that have already been posted on this channel at this point, one of which being the most recent, and that was the Academy M60 A2 Starship. It's literally rinse, wash, and repeat for the exact same detailing. The last thing to mention on the suspension is the track. The track is, of course, the kit original single-piece vinyl tracks, and they simply were painted and weathered to the condition that we have here. Just like I frequently mention in these videos, you don't want to use rattle can spray paint to paint single-piece vinyl tracks because there is the propensity of the tracks having a negative reaction to the paint either immediately or even many years down the road, and the tracks can dry rot on you. In order to prevent this as much as possible, the tracks are painted with Tamiya acrylic flat black. It's applied via the airbrush, and then after the Tamiya flat black is added, I then go ahead and add the next colors, which on this vehicle over here would be the rust color for the metal portions of the track. Of course, as being the octagonal pattern of track, you would have the weathering in the following format. The sections are all pretty much steel construction with the exception of the removable pads that are found right here on the exterior. And on the interior portion of the track, you see the inner track pads, which again would be rubber. The rust color is my own mix. It's exterior latex, and it's the same color that I've utilized on most, or I should say all of the other models that have been brought across on this table. And again, the paint work was all applied with the paintbrush after the airbrush work was concluded. Once the rust color was added, I then went ahead and just lightly weathered the rubber pad sections with an airbrush to the format that we have here. This is an easy way to replicate these tracks, as it's not uncommon for these tracks to have this type of appearance in real life. From the running gear takes to the lower hull, and hopefully the cast texturing that I touched upon earlier in the video is coming out now in better light. And you can see where it looks like all fully painted. Like I always mention in these M48 videos, and also the M60 for that matter as well, the addition of the cast texture on the lower hull and on the turrets on those vehicles is always a great way to add so much extra detailing and extra character to the build, as opposed to leaving it all completely smooth with the original kit configuration. Same, of course, is true for the rear, but while on the rear section, we get to see those other details coming to light, like the taillights, and of course, I painted them in my usual format. The one here on the left-hand side has the cat's eye painted red and the square light painted in silver, and on the one on the opposite side, it's the same thing with the bottom lens, but the top lens is painted in gloss black to replicate the blackout light, which is commonly seen on US military vehicles. Also seen on this section is this guard that we have that comes off of the rear section of the tinwork and connects to the brush guard here for the taillight. And this is something that needs to be addressed when you're motorized and RC converting a M60 or an M48 pattern vehicle. Both of these vehicle types have this distinctive guard that comes down this section over here, and this is obviously something that's going to cause some problems when it comes time for getting the upper and lower hulls fitted in place and also done in a way where they are removable. Fortunately, there's a way to have your cake and eat it too with the system that I developed a little while ago on some motorized converted Tamiya M60A1s that I completed a little while ago and can be found on the channel. Basically, what you do is you have the kit supplied guard right over here, but instead of gluing it to the top portion of the tinwork, you actually glue it to the final drive. With the way the kit is designed, you can have the unit connected to the final drive, and it looks like it blends into the, or I should say it's connected to the tinwork, like the way you see it here. However, this is an illusion because if I flex the tinwork, you can see that that's not the case. So with this design, I have the detailing of the guard in place, but I have the ability to remove the upper from the lower without any sort of complications of these components breaking off on you. Because if you follow the kit and you assemble these where you mount this directly to the tinwork, when it comes time to removing the upper from the lower, these things are going to do nothing but break off and pop off on you, and it's something that you just don't want to constantly repair because it lends for other problems. With this design over here, Again, you can have your cake and eat it too. You have the detailing, and you still have the ability to remove the upper and the lower without any sort of complications. Of course, the same exact fitting is added to the opposite side. Hopping back to the frog nose takes to the remainder of the details, and these are all the kit supply components, and they went to their locations without any sort of fuss. It is a Tamiya after all. This would include the front shackles as well as even the brush guards. What's interesting about the brush guards is that the brush guards recycle the same locations for the A3 kit, but they just are replaced with the A5 patterns that are supplied with the Sgt. York. They just drop directly into place and no other fiddling is required. The only place where the builder is going to have to make a modification is with these two locations over here for the later pattern of headlights. The original M48 kit had the earlier pattern of headlights, and in order to mount these ones in place, there are locations on the hull that need to be drilled out by the builder. Fortunately, Tamiya did a really good job with making this as simple as possible, because on the bottom portion of the upper hull, they have two locations that they indicate with arrows, no less, that tell you where these areas need to be drilled out with a pin vise or any other type of a hole adding procedure, I should say. On the model over here, I used a pin vise to drill the pilot hole, and then I just went up and down these sections with a needle file in order to get the hole at the correct size. Once there, the new headlights just plug directly into place without any sort of issues. This is really the only modification that the builder needs to make in order to get the model built out of the box. The other location where there's a similar story is on the back at the skateboard ramp, and I'll touch upon that momentarily, but alas, it's the exact same thing. There are two indication points that are molded on the inside portion of the model. You just drill them out with a pin vise with a small Dremel bit, and you can then now secure these new components in place. Same type of procedure is utilized on a bunch of other Tamiya kits, so this is something that's not out of their playbook, so to speak. While on the headlights, you can see the way they are painted with the appropriate manner, where the lens on the left-hand side is silver, while the one on the right-hand side is the blackout lens. Of course, a little swipe of gloss lacquer is added to each of these locations in order to give you the sheen that we have here, and the same thing was also done to the taillights on the rear. Other details to point out are the fire extinguisher handles right there in that little box behind the headlight, and the handles are painted in red as they would be on the real vehicle. Again, this is another little bit of detailing that a lot of people tend to overlook on their patent builds, be it an M48 or even an M60. It's one of those things that always look great once done, and it's one that doesn't take a whole lot of work. The only thing you need is a fine paintbrush, a little bit of flat red paint, and you're good to go. Also on the front section, we have these periscopes. These are the kit originals. They went out without any sort of problems. They do have some nice three-dimensional detailing to them. However, one thing to point out is that this is one area where the kit does show its age because the headlights are totally open and there is no lens insert found on the inside. But again, this is something that is a characteristic from the kits of this era. One other feature that I built into this model is the ability to have a functional bow hatch. This is something that's very easily done, and it's a feature I like to build on most of my patent-based vehicles if given the opportunity. With the way the kit is designed, the stem is quite long, so the only thing you have to do to make the piece function is with a soldering iron, you just melt a little tab on the bottom portion of the stem, and that's basically it. Once that's done, the hatch is fully operational and gives you a nice cool little, why not bit of detailing. The piece just swivels out of the way like it does on the real one, and then when it comes time, you just drop it into place, and you have the hatchet now in the closed position. Of course, another bit of detailing found on this area is the heater exhaust manifold. Stock piece, the only thing I did was drill this section out for added detailing, and then the weathering just seals the rest of it off. Of course, the one modification that I made from the kit original is with the X crimps found on the front and rear tin work. Now that the model is fully painted and weathered, you really get to see just how much detailing this gives the build, and it really gives that iconic bit of detailing, which would be a very important focal point found on the Sgt. York vehicle. Being an M48A5, they all had these X crimps fitted in place. The ECA HD 3D printed components really do a good job at giving this bit of missing detailing, and it really does enhance the stock Tamiya kit immensely. Same is true, of course, for the ones found on the rear section, and you can see just how much added detailing they give to the rear as they did to the front. While we're on the back, you can see the exhaust manifold system, stock Tamiya, and basically is weathered in the same manner as I weather all of my patent-based vehicles, with a little soot of airbrush weathering in these two locations over here, which on the real vehicle, well, not so much on the Sgt. York, but on the majority of the patent vehicles is where the exhaust manifold from the engine basically just stick out, and these areas here would blacken up fairly quickly with operation. Of course, Sgt. York, On the real one specifically, that's off the table because the whole back section here is plated over and it's got a whole different design to it. But, you know, since I have the old school grills here, I might as well just weather them in the traditional format. Also, one other thing I want to mention involved the motorization conversion. On the Academy version of the Sgt. York, I had a little difficulty on this section over here where the two sections connect, and I had to build up some areas here with some extra plastruct in order to get everything to fit together in a more streamlined manner. On this one here, that wasn't the case. It just went together out of the box, and it was a very simple procedure. The only thing that I did have, however, was on the inner portion over here, there is a recess cut for the travel lock. This was plated over and polished away with the bodywork that I may have touched upon before, and now that the model's fully completed, you can see just how much better it looks. Of course, all of this here is admittedly totally wrong compared to the actual vehicle, but at least it does have the provision for the travel lock thoroughly blended away, and in my opinion, it just polished it up a little bit further compared to the stock original, as wrong as it may be. While on the skateboard ramp, like I mentioned before, there are two locations that need to be drilled out by the builder with a pin vise. This is very easily done, and once done, this new piece just drops directly in place without any sort of problems. Same is also true for this box over here, which, as far as I'm concerned, I believe Tamiya just completely made up, as I don't recall seeing it on the actual Sgt. Yorks that are still in existence. Regardless, though, it still looks pretty cool, and it's an iconic bit of detailing for the Tamiya Sgt. York kit. Carry on brings us to the rear engine deck. Everything here is stock Tamiya, nothing really much to mention except for the weathering done on the grillwork. Touching it, or I should say I'm moving ahead a little bit to the paint and the weathering, but the patent is definitely the king of louvers, and if you weather them accordingly, it will just give the model just so much extra kick, and it will really be a huge focal point on one of these vehicles. Of course, this is true for all of the vehicles in the patent family, from the 46 all the way up to the M60A2, or A3 for that matter. The last detail thing to mention on the hull is with the tow cables. The Sgt. York kit does have two plastic molded tow cables, and one gets fitted to each of the side tin work. It is a mirror image on the opposite side, as you can see from here. And the pieces themselves are the stock units. They just get mounted as per the kit instructions, and there's nothing really much to mention. They are painted and weathered in the following format, and this is something that I generally mention on these builds, but I always like to paint the tow eyes found on these tow cables, on these USGI tow cables, with a darker shade of olive drab, or sometimes even a olive green type coloring, depending on the vehicle in question. This is a way to give some extra detail fidelity, and also a little bit of extra character to the build, as opposed to leaving it either overpainted with the paint, or with the same color use on the base coat. Because the model here was painted with Tamiya olive green, I went with a dark olive drab for the toe eyes for the reasons that I just mentioned, and as you can see, it does give the model just a little bit of extra color pop. One last thing I do want to touch upon with the tow cables is that because of the way they are molded, they are very frail and thin, and it's not really hard to go ahead and snap one of these during the course of production. So this is the one aspect of the build that's actually one of the more frailer and fragile components that the builder will run across. So when you are working on one of these builds, you definitely want to pay attention to these pieces over here. Take your time, be careful, and make sure you don't accidentally break one. If you do, they're not too hard to repair, but it is something that's going to add a little bit more extra complication to the build as a whole. And this, of course, leads us to the most important aspect of the build, and that is the turret, because it wouldn't be a Sgt. York now if it just had a standard patent turret, now would it? So the turret itself has undergone some small detail upgrades, first of which are the smoke grenade launchers. These are the kit original 1970s, 1980s US AFV launchers, and the kit ones are pretty decent. However, to improve them further, I utilize some of the typical tricks that I often mention in these videos. That would be to drill out the whole section where the smoke grenade cartridges would actually be fitted. They are integrally molded into the kit, but they are a bit on the shallower end, but this is something that's very commonly seen on many kits from the same era and even beyond. With a Dremel bit on a pin vise, I just drilled these areas out, giving it more depth and making the piece look a little bit more accurate. Another bit of detailing that was added was the firing cable that's right over here on the back portion. This was just done with a little bit of floor wire and, again, a micro Dremel bit on a pin vise. Once added in place, you can really see just how much added detailing it does give it. Of course, this detailing is a mirror image found on the reverse side of the model. And on the topic of adding cable detailing, that leads us to the antenna bases. So first you will see a little bit of wiring coming out of this portion here of the turret, and it goes up and into the shelf, and it would actually be connected to the antenna base. This bit of detailing is absent on the stock kit, and when added in place, it gives the model that much added extra detailing. And on the topic of the antennas, this is one area where the kit is a bit soft. The kit does not really render the antenna bases properly. It just basically has a little platform with a hole in it for the use of a bit of wire to get glued in place. On the real vehicle, of course, it would have utilized the standard American antenna base of the era. And for the model over here, I went ahead and added these details. The ones on this model here are cast resin units that I have on hand, and I utilize them on many of my post-World War II American AFV for basically this exact purpose. These units here I copied from the Tamiya M60 A1 kit, and the versions found on those kits are actually very good, and I just simply, cast them and added them to the model here. They are drilled out, and a bit of floor wire is added for the actual antenna. With the antennas added in place, it really gives the model that much added extra detailing. For the antenna bases, just like with the tow cables, I went ahead and painted them with a darker shade of olive drab. This is something that would not be uncommon for antenna bases found on vehicles from this era. And once painted in this format, you can see again how it gives the model just that much added extra character. Hopping back to the front takes to the handles that we have right here, as well as also the handle that we have right here on the side. These were integrally molded into the Tamiya kit as blades, which is again something that's commonly done by Tamiya. And these were simply deleted. The areas were drilled out and new handles were fabricated out of small bits of floor wire. It's a simple bit of detailing to add, and once done, it really gives the model a little bit of extra accuracy and again a little bit of an extra detail polish up. Literally no extra work is required in order to get the model to do this. It just comes like that with the out-of-the-box configuration. On the F16 radar, this piece can pivot up and down, and when you're displaying the vehicle, you want to keep in mind that when you are going to display with the barrels in a certain section, you want to have this unit basically in line, because these two were, I believe, connected to one another, and when these would go up, so would the radar. Continue on the roof takes us to another little handle that was added. And this leads us to the commander section. On this area over here, this is actually a pintle mount for some kind of an armament. More than likely, which is seen on the TACOM version, which is an M60D MG. On the Tamiya one here, that's not present, but they do have a little cap present in place, and the caps on these are generally rubber, so I just painted it to replicate that. Also, one thing to mention is that there are molded in periscopes in these sections over here, and I simply painted them with my usual gloss black technique that I've touched upon in many other videos. One of the other things I want to mention are these handles that we have here on the side, and this is actually one of the more trickier aspects of the build, specifically for someone who's a beginner, because these sections over here you have to be on your A game with, and you want to have the proper tools in order to remove them off of the sprue. Because of their length and their relatively thinness, these components here are non-commonly broken when you're trying to remove them off of the sprue. So if you have your tools in line, you want to be careful when you're removing these components just to prevent any sort of complications with the components breaking on you. If you could get past that hurdle, they assemble very well, as one would imagine from a Tamiya. Moving to the rear takes us to this hatch. As I mentioned before, normally this hatch is something that wouldn't necessarily be mentioned, but because on this build, it is concealing the hat trick, which is the main motorization access to the switch. Here you can see what it looks like now that the piece is fully painted. There's the switch on the inside. You note I went ahead and painted it for forward and reverse as well as for the off position. And you will see exactly how this all pans out once the vehicle is in operation. But like I mentioned before, the added benefit of this system here is you have really good access to the switch, and once the hatch is fitted in place, it looks completely indistinguishable from a standard static model with the hatch just permanently glued on in its location. Moving back up to the turret roof takes us to the optic, and this, as well as these little boxes over here, is something that I do want to mention. Both of these components are something that are more or less a suggestion in their installation, as opposed to something that's a bit more, shall we say, concrete. So unlike all the other components where there's a tongue and groove or some kind of alignment system, for these pieces over here, that's not the case. It's basically just have the component on the instructions with an arrow pointing to where they go, and you just have to basically make sure that you put them in the right location. It's definitely true for the box over here. I want to make sure they are symmetrical on the opposite side. But for the optic over here, these two little wings are found on the sprue, and you have to remove them, deburr them, and then secure them to the optic. And when you do, you want to make sure that they are on in the appropriate manner. There's a tiny little like shelf or a flat area, it's just a flat area, and these pieces have to be glued on in a pinpoint manner. If they're on in the canted manner, it's going to go into the optic, and that's not helping you. Or you can just have it off-centered, and it just doesn't, again, give you any benefits. So when you're installing these components over here, you have to take your time and make sure everything is on in the appropriate location and also on in a square manner. You do that, and the pieces will work out just fine. Finally, moving to the front takes us to the twin 40mm Bofors, and these are the kit originals and went on without any sort of problems. You just want to be careful when you're installing these conical flash suppressors to make sure that use enough glue where they don't pop off on you. Also, you want to make sure that the pieces are glued on in the appropriate manner and they aren't shifted or are mounted ajar. These are the type of things that you want to make sure they're absolutely true, because otherwise they will definitely be something that will be noticed and will hurt the look of the build. Also, when it comes to painting, these units are one of the sections that are added at the very tail end of the build. Note they are this black oxide or parkerized coloring, and this is best done off the model, as the remainder of the paint work gets done with the different techniques that you with these units over here. So rather than trying to paint them on the model, it's really best done off the build, and then you just mount them at the tail end, leaving for the end results that you see here. And that's all there is to mention about the detailing. This takes us to the paint and the weathering work. So for the paint work, obviously I went with a Merc camouflage pattern for this vehicle. It is a 1980s era vehicle, and it is a Sgt. York, which legally means it should have a Merc. Having said that, it does look very attractive in all dark olive drab, as we saw in the box art, but that's hopefully a topic for another video for another day. For this particular version, I wanted to go with a camouflage pattern. Now, on the box art, it has the vehicle represented with a desert camo, red desert or gray desert if I'm not mistaken. However, for this one here, I went with the winter verdant. The reason why I went with this version of the Merc as opposed to the other is because, well, I like the desert camo. I like it so much, I actually already built a Sgt. York in 1/35 scale with that exact same camouflage, and it was done to the Academy 1/35 scale Sgt. York kit that was mentioned in a previous video on this channel. Also, on a topic of a recent completed Merc vehicle, I did another Winter Verdant camo on the Academy M60A2 Starship. The reason why both of those builds are relevant to point out is not just for, well, shameless shilling on my channel, so you have to watch other videos, but it's because of the techniques used to paint them. All three of the vehicles were painted in the exact same format with basically the same paints. The other Sgt. York, the colors were slightly different because of the desert camo. However, the brown color that is used is the same one that I used for this one and the Starship. Also, the application of the paint was done in the same manner. As I've touched upon in those other videos, the Merc camouflage scheme was a paint by number system that was applied by the crews. And depending on the type of paint equipments that the crews had, you had some vehicles painted with spray guns and others were painted with paintbrushes. Sometimes you had a mix of two, and I've already touched upon this in great depth in those other videos, where I've seen ones where the camouflage was painted with a paintbrush while the little leaflets were painted with a spray gun, and vice versa, or you have all spray gun and all paintbrush. There's lots of variations available, which is, you know, fun for the builder. However, after building a lot of these Merc tanks over the years, I came to the conclusion that, in my opinion, they look the best with the paintbrush applied method. When you apply the camouflage with this type of method, it makes for a very sharp and crisp paint job, and it really does look very nice aesthetically. The airbrush ones look good too, but between the two, in my opinion, I really do prefer the paintbrush applied versions like you see here. For the colors, like I referenced before with the Starship, it's the same colors used on this one here. So first, the entire model, of course, was primed with flat black, spray paint specifically. Then I went ahead and airbrushed the model in a base coat of Tamiya olive green. Once the Tamiya olive green was airbrushed, the remainder of the camouflage pattern was applied via the paintbrush. For the Merc brown that we have here, this is Mission Models acrylic paint, and as I mentioned before, I absolutely Love this paint. It is a godsend, specifically if you like building Merc tanks as much as I do. The colors were always something that were hit and miss, and it was like a black magic art in order to get the right colors cobbled together in order to give you the Merc colors. And with the Mission Models paints having this brown color just ready to go out of the bottle, it is really something that is long overdue in the hobby, and the paint is excellent. So all of the paintwork was applied with the paintbrush. Then the leaflets were also applied with the paintbrush. For the white, this here is just flat exterior latex white. It is diluted, so it's nice and thin, and it was applied in the various locations that you see. And the black leaflets are just Tamiya flat black. Again, applied with the paintbrush. As I referenced in both the Starship and the other Academy Sgt. York video, the Mission Models paint is absolutely excellent, but it does have one Achilles heel, and that is it is ridiculously soluble to water and moisture. So why that's relevant is, first, you know, when you handle the model, it could potentially wear off. That's part of the reason why I wear gloves, by the way, in these videos. But another reason is with the decals. These being water slide decals, you can clearly see how it's going to be a problem when the paint is water soluble. So what I do is, after the camouflage pattern was applied, I went ahead and added the weathering. The weathering was done with the airbrush. I have several coats of a filter on it. It's basically a white washing type filter, even though that is also a moisture applied paint, is applied such thin layers and such a thin mist that it doesn't cause any sort of compromise to the brown paint itself. And then the entire model gets its counter shading effects with the use of an airbrush. Once the airbrush is done, Tamiya, or I should say after the airbrushing is done for the counter shading, I go ahead and add the chipping effects such as here with the dry brush, as well as I also add the Tamiya panel line accents to all the various locations, leaving for the rich look that you see on all the crevices. The Tamiya panel line accent is an excellent material. It's a great product. I've been using it now for about 2 years, 3 years now, and I'm not looking back. It is exquisite, and it really does make the model have some excellent results. It really gets in there to the fine little fasteners. It really makes things pop. Can't recommend that stuff enough. It is absolutely awesome. So after all that weathering work is done, it's then time to apply the markings. So before I can apply the markings, the entire model is actually coated in VMS matte varnish. This is another product that I've highly touted on this channel for excellent reasons. It is awesome. It's applied via the airbrush. It is an acrylic-based product, so it goes on very, very smooth, very, very effortlessly. And once the product is applied, you let the thing fully dry. Once the stuff dries, it really does make the surface as flat as possible. Again, this is not just with the sheen, but also just with the paint. The brush strokes are completely just flat, and everything just looks absolutely stellar. Another interesting side effect of the VMS is that when it makes contact with the Mission Models paint, you can see how it gives it this modded look, and it gives these little stains here and there on the paint. And this is definitely a super happy accent because it just makes the model's weathering look so much better and more realistic. It's a really, really happy accent. But, of course, the reason why I add that varnish for all those positive reasons, but the other reason is because now with the varnish on the surface, the paint is impervious to moisture. At that point there, I can add the water slide decals to the various locations, to which then, once the decals are all dried in place, they get sealed in with a second coat of the VMS, leaving for the final end result that you see here. As for the decal quality themselves, they were absolutely excellent. They went on without any sort of problems, and they were able to varnish onto the surface without any sort of problems whatsoever. These decals here are at least 30-something years old, and they went on as perfectly as the day they were printed. As you can see, the decals are absolutely perfect. So if you're working on one of these older Tamiya Sgt. York kits, fear not, the decals are definitely going to work for you, or I should say they have a really good chance on working well for you. One last thing I wanted to touch upon back on the application of the camo is, again, when you're applying the camouflage pattern with a paintbrush, you want to have certain skill sets in place. It's very different compared to airbrushing. And you basically have to make sure that the brush strokes are nice and blended in. And the way to do this is that the paint needs to be at the proper consistency. Too thick, too chunky, too thin, too runny. So this is something that's going to take a little bit of practice in order to get the hang of. But once you get the hang of it, this opens up an entirely new option and avenue in order to paint camouflage on your builds, and you're able to, you know, step outside the comfort zone. Specifically if you're like me and you're just used to airbrushing everything, it really does open up so much more avenues for different camouflage patterns that can be applied to your tank models. And also it affects on the final end results that they can have. Typically at this point, that would be basically the end of the video. Go into skill level recommendations, but not this one yet, because this model here was converted to be motorized, and there's no point on going through this entire video and not having this thing being shown in its operational condition. So right now the model is fully connected to its twin AA batteries, and this thing here is ready for a run. So I went ahead and took off the rear hatch in order to get access to the switch. And let's go ahead and turn this model on. I want to carefully hold this. It's a little tricky to do on camera, but red should be forward and blue should be reversed from my memory. It's been a while actually since I built and ran this thing. So let's see how it performs now that it is fully completed. It would help if I had something a little bit sturdier than that little flimsy bottle rocket. So here, I got a cartridge over here. Okay, so I have it in reverse. Blue is actually forward. But as you can see, the thing has some pretty good speed to it. There we go. Doesn't really have a whole lot of miles on it right now, but as you can see, she runs pretty good. Definitely one of the more unique motorized tanks in my collection for sure. And since it would be video malpractice after mentioning the other model for the duration of this video here and there to not at least give it a quick cameo, here is the other 1/35 scale M247 Sgt. York that I built recently. This one here is the Academy counterpart, and the one adjacent to it, of course, is the Tamiya one. And just like with the Tamiya one, the radar is in the folded state because it fits better in the display case that way. There we go. Having the two side by side, you really get to appreciate the two different Merc camouflage patterns in comparison. Also, comparing them side by side, you really get to see just how much of a true copy the Academy one is compared to the original Tamiya counterpart. The two are basically identical. The real big difference in the external fittings really is with one thing and one thing only, and this was only something I noticed because I built both of these, and that is with the side guard that we have here. On the Tamiya one, you can see, hopefully the camera zooms in, and you will see a tiny little hole right here that's integrally molded in. On the Academy, it is actually absent, and silly me, it was such of a small little bit of detailing that I even missed it, and I forgot to add it with the pin vise. So if you are working on an Academy M247, just be sure to add that little bit of detailing, and basically your Academy is going to be on par with the Tamiya in almost every single respect. It really is a cool feeling to have both options of the Sgt. York in my collection, being the version from Academy as well as the one from Tamiya. I do have the Tacom one, in case anyone is wondering. That's in the stash. It is going to be built at some point, so stay tuned for that for a future upcoming video. Also, as I touched upon before, there are so many different versions of the Merc camouflage scheme, and basically all of them look really cool in their own regard. Which means you can have not just the same type of vehicle built in duplicates in your collection, but also with the same kit, no less. And each one of them will look completely different, no two will look alike, and each of them will have their own specific personality and character to them, which will do nothing but further enhance and complete your collection as a whole. As you can see, you have two variants right here on the table. This one here is the Winter Verdant. This one here is the Gray Desert, and it'll be really cool to have another one of these older Tamiya Sgt. York kits, but rendered in the Summer Verdant version.
In the business, we call this foreshadowing.
And at the end of the day, this build cannot have turned out any better. I absolutely love how this model turned out, and having one of these models built to this condition here, added to the collection, it's definitely not something I regret in any way, shape, or form. Even though these models here are far from perfect, that doesn't change the fact that they are an absolute blast to build, and when they're finished, they actually do turn out and polish up very nicely. Which, if I didn't know any better, I say it's the perfect point to lead us into skill level and recommendation. So, the Tamiya M247 Sgt. York, is this something that a beginner can build? Absolutely. In fact, I can speak from personal experience because I personally have built one of these exact same kits at the ripe young age of 8 years old, and I think it's safe to say that by the age of 7 and 8, you're pretty much a beginner for all intents and purposes. The Tamiya kit is very forgiving in that respect, and basically anyone can put one of these together, which again is just a testament to just how builder-friendly these Tamiya models really are, specifically the ones from the older generations. Of course, there are some areas that a beginner is going to be challenged slightly with the build, like the intersection of the trunnion area, as well as also with some of the smaller details found on the exterior, like the grab handles on the turret and the radar systems. Things like that will require a slight soft touch, which is something that a beginner may not necessarily have the skill levels fully ironed out. However, it's definitely far from impossible for someone with one of those early type skill sets to definitely tackle on their own. For the other builders, namely someone who's an intermediate to an advanced range, this is going to be a build here that they're not necessarily going to be recommended, specifically since generally if you are the type of person who's an advanced skill range builder, either A, you've already built one of these kits back in the day, or B, you're going to find one of these kits severely lacking, specifically with the deficiencies that I did touch upon earlier. Generally, people with the more advanced skill sets tend to want a model that's more accurately detailed, and if that's the case, the old Tamiya kit here is really not necessarily going to be your cup of tea. If that's you, and you're an advanced range builder, I would really more or less steer you towards the tack-on model, as that's something that's going to be more to your liking, as opposed to this old vintage kit that we have here. As for the intermediate builder, again, much along the lines of what I mentioned before with the advanced builder. However, an intermediate builder may be recommended this kit more than the other individual for the simple fact that you may not necessarily have all of your skill sets ironed out. And if that's the case, if you're looking for a nice practice build, specifically if you're looking for something that, you're not really a super diehard, Sgt. York fan, you just want a vehicle that's a Sgt. York and you want one that's relatively easily built. If that's you, then this kit here would definitely be more to your speed. You get the look and the feel of the Sgt. York, but you don't have nearly the same complexity as the TACOM counterpart. So if you're just a casual medium builder, the Tamiya kit here definitely becomes more relevant in that regard. One advantage that this kit does have is that because at heart it is a Tamiya M48A3 kit, there are a plethora of aftermarket detail solutions out there in order to add to this model over here in order to enhance it from its stock original offering. There are lots of detail components out there in photo etch, cast resin, as well as in 3D print. Not just like the ones I mentioned in this video with the X-crimp inserts, but there are also several on the market from the other aftermarket companies, all of which can be added to the stock model over here in order to polish it up further from the stock original offering. However, as I mentioned in the Academy Sgt. York video, is this something that's really worth it? This is best left up to the discretion of the builder. As enjoyable as this kit is, there are several deficiencies on it that really are just not worth correcting in my opinion, as again, with the amount of work required to thoroughly rebuild the rear engine deck area, in that case, you might as well just opt for the TACOM model since that's really something that you're looking for. But if you just want to grab one of these patents and say you have some spare parts on hand, or you just want to give it a nice little surface facelift, in that case, then yeah, those aftermarket components can be sprinkled on, and it will improve the model overall compared to just leaving it in the original kit configuration. Which is much along the lines as I did on this build over here. And really nothing much more needs to be said about that topic, and this leads us firmly to recommendations. So this model here is basically going to be rinse, washed, and repeated what I mentioned in recommendations on the Academy M247 Sgt. York video that was recently posted on this channel. But as a quick recap, this model here is definitely a model that's recommended for anyone who's an avid fan of not just the Sgt. York platform, but also of the Patton family of vehicles. This vehicle is also recommended for anyone who's just a fan of post-World War II American armor or just Cold War armor in general. Being a Tamiya kit, this is another type of individual I'll recommend this kit to, as there are lots of people out there that are avid fans of building and collecting the model kits from Tamiya. If you have the Tamiya M48 Patton, you could easily complete the collection by adding the Sgt. York to your collection. I would also recommend this kit for anyone who's just a fan of anti-aircraft vehicles. If you have the Chaparral, the Schlieke, or the M163 Vulcan, the old Tamiya Sgt. York kit here is a valid addition to add to your collection as well. Realistically, the one individual I would not recommend this kit to would be anyone who is a die-hard rivet counting perfectionist, and if you're looking for a perfectly scaled down version of the Sgt. York, then obviously this Tamiya kit is not going to be for you. If that's you, again, your best and really only option on the table is to go for the TACOM model. That is going to be something that's going to check way more boxes compared to this older kit here. This is a vintage kit, and as much as I enjoyed building it, it does definitely have some limitations, and it definitely shows its age in many respects. But outside of that individual, as I brushed upon earlier, if you are just a casual fan of this vehicle, say you play with it in War Thunder and you just have a blast with it and you just love the history and the vehicle as a whole, but you're not really a die-hard model builder, well, if that's you, then the Tamiya kit here is actually one that is highly recommended in that regard. Like I just referenced before, if you want to scratch that Sgt. York itch, but you don't have nearly the patience or really the interest in going for the TACOM, the Tamiya one here cannot be recommended enough. On a similar note, one area where this kit still has its relevance, and it's actually one that's even more relevant for this kit than it is with the TACOM, is if you are the type of individual that radio control converts these 1/35 scale models. As awesome as the TACOM model is, it is meant to be a static model first and foremost. This one here was originally designed to be motorized, and because of that, motorized and RC converting it is far more easily done in comparison to the modern super kit counterpart. As we've seen in this video, the addition of the Tamiya gearbox fits right in, and it's basically fits in and it takes to like a duck to water. Also, with the unique size and shape of the turret, this does lend itself for extra room on the interior for equipment, which I have seen individuals fully RC and full option RC these 135s, and they were able to make a 135 with functions and all that with space that was smaller compared to the Sgt. York here. One of those individuals, this kit here is going to be something that they could easily adapt to radio controlled, and it will actually be a really cool project in that regard. One other person who I would not necessarily recommend this kit to would be anyone who's into making diorama displays. Although basically every tank model out there can be added to a diorama scene in one flavor or another, for this kit over here, although that is still possible, I would, again, for that type of person, I would steer them more towards the TACOM release for the added advantages that that kit does have. Outside of the higher detail fidelity, that kit does have workable track links as well as even a working suspension, which for a diorama setting would definitely be more conducive compared to the older kit here. One last thing I want to mention about this kit is that if you are interested in picking one of these up, you may want to pick one up sooner than later. Just like I mentioned with the Academy Sgt. York kit, these kits here have not been in production for a little while now, and what's on the market is basically on the market. These kits have drifted into collectability, and the prices for a while were going up on them. However, while I was filming this particular take here, I actually checked the prices on them, and they have leveled off back to prices that are far more sane. There are, of course, one or two outliers that are asking for, my opinion, ludicrous amounts of money for one of these older kits here, but the majority of the kits that are on the market are still roughly retailing for about the $33 to about $35 price range, which in my opinion is definitely fair for one of these kits. Also, just like what I mentioned on the Academy one, is that This kit here, it's actually highly unlikely if Tamiya is ever going to do another re-release batch. Having said that, they have surprised us from time to time and re-released several of their vintage kits, so it may be something that they might do in the future. However, one thing I learned about Tamiya, never really bank on their re-releases. So if you are interested in one of these kits, definitely pick one up sooner than later. And with that, that wraps up this model showcase video for this 1/35th scale M247 Sgt. York DIVAD air defense system. If you like this video, be sure to subscribe to this channel, where it's a great way to keep updated on new posted content, being 1/35th scale model showcase videos like this one over here, or the other larger scale project update videos that frequently get posted to this channel. Another way to keep in loop of new posted content is by liking us on Facebook. There, I have more photographs of this particular build, as well as the other smaller and larger scale builds that have been seen on this channel in the past. Furthermore, don't forget to swing by eastcoastarmory.com for more 1/6 and 1/16 scale builds and detail components. Thanks again, I'll be seeing you all again on the next one. Till then.